My name is Robert Gibbons, and I'm the Director of Education at the California Association for Nonprofits, also known as CalNonprofits. And I'd like to welcome you to our Philanthropic Reform Update webinar. Today, we will be discussing two game-changing proposals from the federal government, and we've assembled a really all-star lineup of experts from across the legal, academic, and nonprofit worlds to join us. Now, before we get going, I do want to give a quick plug about CalNonprofits. And you can see here some of the member benefits that we offer. However, I believe that one of our most important offerings is providing webinars like these to our nonprofit community, creating spaces for dialogue and advancing important advocacy issues like this one. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists and speakers today. Beginning with our CEO and Executive Director of CalNonprofits, Jan Masaoka. We also have John Pratt, the Senior Research Fellow at the Minnesota Council for Nonprofits, who will be our moderator. Chuck Collins, the Director of Program on Inequality and the Common Good. Professor Daryl K. Jones from Florida A&M University, and also the author of the Nonprofit Law Professors blog. And Alex Reed, partner at Baker Hostetler, where he is the national team leader on tax-exempt organizations and charitable giving. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And now I'll hand it over to Jan.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everybody. So I think you guys know we have over 900 people we're expecting today. So I'm glad we're getting started on time. So I wanted to say a little bit why CalNonprofits would be sponsoring this session. And I think that, if I were to be asked, what are the two public policy issues that are the most emotionally felt by our members? They would be those two would be, one would be contracting, problems with government contracting, and the other one would be donor advised funds. And there's just an enormous amount of frustration and anger with the way that donor advised funds are managed today. And so this issue is really something that comes from our members. Now, some of those complaints about donor advised funds probably aren't very realistic. Like they kind of come back, like, why aren't more people using their donor advised funds to give money to my organization? But I think there are policy issues as well. And at CalNonprofits, our main concern from a policy perspective is the mismatch between the timing of the charitable deduction and the timing of public benefit. So what I mean by that, for example, is that if I were to take $10 million and to give it to a nonprofit today, that today I would also get $10 million, taken off my taxable income, and the nonprofit would get $10 million today. But if I take that $10 million and I put it into a donor advised fund, I still get the charitable deduction today, but does the nonprofit get the money? There's no time limit on it. So the donor has to give that money out sometime between today and infinity. And our goal is that it should be something closer than infinity. And I think so that mismatch, a lot of things that we hear donors saying they want to do, like they want to put the money aside and give it at a larger amount later. We think that's a great idea. You just shouldn't get the tax deduction now. So that gap between the tax deduction and the public benefit is the policy issue that concerns us. It's also an issue for our state attorney general. 2 years ago, the state did what they called a mandatory survey, I like that phrase, of donor advised sponsors that operate in California. Now, they only did big ones, California-based non-DAF sponsors with 10 million or more in assets, and national ones with 200 million or more in assets. So it was a limited sample. I think the most surprising finding of all for me was that even though the distribution ratios, how much they give out in a given year, were varied all over the map, that community foundations were actually more likely than the commercial ones to have distributions of lower than 5%. But in terms of policy, they identified 4 areas of concern. The first one is donations of private foundations to donor advised funds, presumably helping to meet with their payout requirements while still maintaining complete control over those funds. The second area of concern they identified was donor advised fund to donor advised fund, DAF to DAF. In fact, they found that 11% of grants made from donor advised funds were made to other donor advised funds rather than to active nonprofits. And then the third one was fees charged, and seeing a lot of fees related to administrative fees and fees for trades and things like that. I do see a question about slides. We don't have slides for this. Okay, so you will get a recording later on, but this is meant to be more of a discussion than a slideshow to tell you the truth. The fourth area of concern identified by the Attorney General was the conflict of interest inherent in donor advised funds, because they have an incentive to keep the funds there, as opposed to have them sent out to active nonprofits. So I think that summarizes the issues. The reasons why we're involved with donor advised funds as an issue, and we're really glad to have a national audience today, as well as so many of our members. And I do want to give out a quick little shout out to Vu Le from the Nonprofit AF blog for helping get the word out about today's webinar. Okay, so now that I've made those comments, I'm going to turn this over to John Pratt, who's going to serve as our moderator today. And actually, one other thing I want to say, this is a very intimidating webinar to be on, because all of these people are national leaders in the issue of philanthropic reform. So, so they all have way more data than they're going to be allowed to present. So, John, good luck with that.
Thank you, Jan. And thank you, CalNonprofits. Clearly, given the audience, we see sort of the national distribution. CalNonprofits is a real leader in this area, and nonprofits really need that on these public policy issues and fundraising issues. So our goals today are to educate ourselves about the proposals, to explore sort of the implications and what other issues need to be addressed in this area, to promote transparency and accountability, and to share insights on both the current state and what are the prospects for change. What could we see? So, and then we'll be posing questions throughout. I'm going to start out with kind of a brief history, a little bit of how did we get here? What is our situation, sort of the structure of it? Looking at how do we regulate philanthropy and charities, and how did IRS get oversight of charitable tax incentives, foundations, nonprofit regulation, and reporting. So to start out with, we should acknowledge the power to tax is also the power to regulate, and we can see this ongoing tension over the last century. So partly this is a line drawing exercise of sort of what's in, what's out, what counts as a charitable deduction or gets an incentive. And so these are foregone taxes. Money that would have been paid in taxes is a substantial chunk of sort of the benefit to donors. And it could be sort of corporations getting deductions from the corporate income tax, or individuals from the individual income tax. The federal role, having a substantial role in this, really goes back to 1913, when this country adopted an income tax and then passed a revenue act the same year. So there wasn't a national income tax before then, and part of the new regime in 1913 was also that charitable organizations would not be paying taxes. So that was an incentive, something they want to encourage. There is kind of a, sort of a tension too between, are nonprofits and philanthropy creatures of the tax code or creatures of the First Amendment? And they're really come out of both, and these rights and privileges exist in both areas. For a long time after the IRS was given this expanded tax, there was sort of a gradual sort of development of a bureaucracy to oversee this area. And there was sort of, Congress had sort of concerns, kind of a populist concern about, was both about tax evasion, the role of wealth, the potential for elite philanthropy to use their money to control and gain power in the country. And also ultimately in the 60s, there was a lot of concern about the role of private foundations in supporting the civil rights movement. And specifically, a number of the congressional leaders then were Democrats from the South, and were in key roles to adopt the 1969 Tax Reform Act that created sort of the basic structure of public charities and private foundation regulation. And partly it was to limit some of the powers of private foundations, including limiting their role to fund political activity, especially voter registration or lobbying activity, and also to sort of establish sort of limits on self-dealing and concerns about sort of were people benefiting personally from these private foundations. There have been huge shifts in the economy in the 50 years since the 69 Tax Reform Act, and that partly leads to this discussion today. And Jan talked about the growth of donor advised funds, which was not even anticipated in 1969, and just the growth as a percentage of sort of charitable giving going to private foundations and donor advised funds. There's been a continuing sort of tweaks to the 69 law. Some of the major ones was the Tax Reform Act of 1976, broadened lobbying allowances for 501c3 organizations. And in 2006, the Pension Protection Act clarified what was allowed for and definitions of DAFs and reporting by DAFs. There are now 34 different types of nonprofit organizations exempt under the Internal Revenue Code. Just the instructions to IRS Form 990 runs over 100 pages. So this is a highly regulated area. But our question today is, how does all the shifts and changes and things we've learned, including about sort of changes in the economy, changes in sort of the demographics of the country and other tax laws, what are the implications for how it should be regulated now? Our speakers today are from across the US and represent a broad spectrum and knowledge of proposals to reform the structures and incentives for philanthropy, including the recent federal proposals that are being discussed. And so to start out with, we would like to hear from Alex Reed. And Alex, your experience with the Joint Committee on Taxation and at Treasury, the Office of Tax Policy, certainly give you a longer perspective on how Treasury takes the lead in these issues. Can you talk about sort of the two active proposals now?
Sure, absolutely. So thank you so much for the introduction. I think that was a great overview. And there's sort of I would say a big picture, a battle for the soul of the nonprofit sector. Are we going to continue let's call it the spirit of 69, which is to put restrictions on nonprofit organizations to protect the status quo from nonprofit influence over the status quo? Or are we going to pull back on some of those restrictions and allow nonprofits to push their vision of how to change the world? And so that's kind of at heart what we're looking at here. So the Treasury proposal in particular that we're looking at, the Green Book proposal, as we call it in Washington, is the idea that a private foundation, when it is making its annual distributions in order to meet its minimum required payout of 5%, should a private foundation be allowed to make those grants to a donor advised fund with respect to which the private foundation has advisory privileges? Okay, so the law says private foundations must make these distributions. Private foundations sometimes have good reasons for not being very sure of how much they need to distribute because they don't know their assets until well after the end of the year. So there's a calendar year that ends, and they have to meet their 5% of total assets payout requirement by that point, but they may not know the actual asset values until they receive K-1s from underlying partnership investments, et cetera, which may not be till April or May of the following year. So what do? Well, they often will over distribute to make sure that they don't run afoul of that 5% rule. And they'll put some of their distributions into a donor advised fund so that they can kind of save it for later, make sure they meet their requirement, but have some advisory privileges with respect to those funds. So that's the benign reason for doing it. The negative reason, if you're sitting at Treasury, you might say, well, gee, isn't this a loophole? I mean, the law says private foundations must distribute 5%, but they're only distributing it to an entity that they kind of control. I mean, they don't really control it because they don't have fiduciary powers and they don't have legal ownership of the funds, but they have these advisory privileges. And aren't those advisory privileges tantamount to legal control? If they are, then this is a loophole, and private foundations are avoiding their congressionally required minimum payout by putting funds in donor advised funds. So that's the rationale for the proposal. The counter response to that is, well, wait a second, advisory privileges are not legal control. They are not ownership. And the sponsoring org that has the donor advised fund program is the true legal owner, not the private foundation. So even if the private foundation is making a gift to a sponsoring org, that should be permitted because the private foundation loses legal control over those funds. So there's this question of, is advice equivalent to control within the eyes of the law? Okay, so that's the main Treasury proposal. The other proposal is this idea of imposing a minimum payout requirement on donor advised funds, similar to private foundations. Treasury has talked about this, Congress has talked about this, and it's in the ether, even if it's not a formal proposal in the Green Book, the legislative proposals from Treasury to Congress. The idea would be just as a private foundation is required to distribute at least 5% of its assets every year to qualifying charitable organizations, so too should a donor advised fund, not the sponsoring org, but each donor advised fund on a DAF by DAF basis be required to distribute at least 5%. So we saw there are a lot of variations on this proposal. A more strict version of it you saw in Representative Camp's tax reform draft from 2014, which was donor advised funds have 5 years to distribute contributions that they receive. Other proposals we see in the ACE Act, things like a donor advised fund should exist for only 20 years. And all of the funds it receives should be distributed within those 20 years. So any sort of time limitation or minimum payout requirement, the idea is we don't trust the person or entity with advisory privileges to exercise their judgment about the distribution of funds, and we need to impose some legal rules that constrain their judgment and tell them what they must do in order to maintain their tax status. So those are the two proposals that we're talking about today.
And could you say more, like the Green Book proposal? Is this a pending regulation? Is it proposed? Is this an idea being floated? Sort of, what's its status?
Yeah. So a Green Book proposal is the administration's proposal. And so it is coming from President Biden. It would be considered something that if Congress were to enact it, he would certainly not oppose it. He would sign it. He might even try to view it as a good thing that a proposal like that was taken up by Congress. So obviously the president only has signing power over legislation, but Congress certainly looks to what ideas come out of the Treasury Department in considering and crafting their tax legislation.
So this is kind of a pathway to new legislation.
Absolutely. Traditionally, if you were doing big tax legislation and you wanted to make sure that you had all the stakeholders at the table, the executive branch and the president, the Treasury, would lead that effort, and they'd sit down and they'd start drafting the bill, and then invite the stakeholders from the Finance Committee in the Senate and the Ways and Means Committee in the House to sit down at the table and help develop that legislation. Recently, things have been a little bit fractured in Congress and in Washington. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but it's less cozy than it was, say, in 1986, when the last major tax reform was taken up. But that's the way that it was done then, with Treasury leading the effort.
Great, thank you. So, Professor Darrell Jones, first, how are you? Because I know Florida A&M is based in Tallahassee, but you're in Orlando. What have you heard? And you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, Tallahassee's getting it worse than we are here in Orlando. In fact, it looks like the worst of it is passed over Orlando, so I'm doing just fine.
Okay, well, we'll be thinking of you. Could you talk about the Wimpy syndrome, named after the crafty character in Popeye cartoons? So why are people taken in by this, and why didn't the IRS sort of defer the recognition of deduction for DAF contributions until the public benefit is realized? Why was that a mistake?
So the Wimpy syndrome is just a phrase I use to describe the donors saying, I'll gladly pay you for a tax deduction. I'll gladly pay you tomorrow for a tax deduction today. And as Jan mentioned, tomorrow might be a million tomorrows from now. And so I think that is sort of the bone in people's throats. We've already talked about the infinite delay in disbursements. Although, Alex and I talked about this yesterday privately, and of course, it's not that charities are getting less, because of course the money sitting in a DAF is earning interest, and so the payout in the future is going to equal the amount that was deducted, presumably. What was your second?
Was that a sort of inflection point where the IRS could have decided it the other way?
Well, we have to ask ourselves whether what we have now is better than nothing. If the IRS might have said, sure, they might have said, well, you don't get the deduction until the payout, and I guess I think that, but I think that's a better outcome. But who's to say that if we sort of got rid of the signature feature of a DAF, deduction today, payout tomorrow, that the same amount of money would be directed towards nonprofits? Some people would just take their money and go and do something else with it, I presume. So I don't know that the concept of giving up real control over my money today should not be enough so I get the deduction today. The only problem is it's probably not, the donors are probably not giving up real control, right? They retain advice. And I don't know that at least a commercial sponsor would ever ignore a donor's advice. So what I'm saying is the IRS made a reasonable choice if they had a choice. Mm-hmm. And that's because, maybe they were thinking, well, the more money earmarked for charity, even if it's not paid out until much later, the better.
So this question of, does the donor actually, effectively maintain control? I know you have a RICO case in Florida coming up, and a lot of the issues around RICO is, does the leaders maybe not actually engaging in the actions, but are they controlling the actions of others? Well,
I guess I'm willing to assume that the people who put the money in are in fact controlling its disbursements. I'm willing to assume that. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. There are, I guess, moral hazards to allowing that, but still there's still more money on paper, devoted towards charity rather than personal consumption. So maybe that second best solution is better than no solution at all, or no incentive for more charitable giving at all.
Great. Thank you, Daryl. Chuck, these are kind of epic political struggles, and Congress is having a very tough time almost with any legislation these days. But could you talk about, well, I want to say first, congratulations on your piece in Newsweek and your ongoing leadership on this set of issues. But what do you see as the causes of resistance to philanthropic reform, especially the roles of everything from the financial services industry to other nonprofits to community foundations?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think one way to think of this is there are professional associations and powerful financial companies and others who are happy to keep the status quo. And so far, even with hundreds of us on a webinar today and doing advocacy, it's not at all a countervailing power to the power of the Council of Foundations. There's a network, the Community Foundation Awareness Network, who's lobbied against any reform, and they're effective in the way any professional association is focused on defending the status quo. So whether you're dentists or accountants, you don't want government telling you what to do, and they take that stand. And I think one of the things that's happened is the financial services industry has discovered DAFs. I mean, this surge of money going into DAFs, and just to put it in context, now 1 out of $5 given to charities goes to a DAF. 11 of the biggest charity recipients now are DAFs. Part of that, and just Google DAF and tax benefits, and you'll see all kinds of propositions, and the main selling point is you get your tax, just as Jan said, the mismatch is the selling point. You get your tax break today, and you can treat it like a legacy giving instrument. Your children can decide how to give it away. So it's even being marketed with a sort of capital preservation legacy mentality. And of course, that's not everybody. I think when we get people thinking about DAFs, we want them to think about revolving door, flow, money in, money out. And there are good reasons why people might put money in 1 year into a DAF and then trickle it out over a couple of years. But it's becoming more and more of another financial instrument marketed as tax avoidance. And there's even a growing segment of impact investing, money that's given to a DAF. The deduction is taken in this year, but that fund is put into impact investing for decades. That is kind of not the original intent, which was flowing. So I guess I would say the defenders of the status quo have done a good job scaring members of Congress away from taking this on. There's a community foundation in most districts, and all they have to do is raise the concern that this is going to diminish giving in their lobbying.
So they've adopted the same positions as the commercial DAFs?
Yeah, and of course the commercial DAFs are also lobbying. We see less of that because they have a bigger lobbying agenda, but we know they're in there, and their message is ignore these little insects flying over here that are talking about reforming DAFs. Just leave us alone. That And it gets to the second question, which is sort of like, who's the constituency for reform? In addition to the nonprofit sector here in California and Minnesota, your leadership and Jan's leadership have been vocal and engaged. And the nonprofit sector as a whole is an important constituency. I think now, though, people who care about inequality, tax fairness, democracy, and the wider public are all constituencies that I think would be engaged on this. And just to mention an Ipsos poll from a year ago, of course, most people have no idea what we're talking about here. But once they sort of understand the basics of a private foundation and a DAF, people support a sort of simple common sense reform. You get the tax break, pay out the DAF funds within 2 years. Half of the public thinks pay it out within 2 years. 72% say pay it out within 5 years. So there's a wider constituency for common sense charity reform than we think there is, I believe.
Thank you. So, Jan, could you talk about the California example? You proposed legislation and you experienced sort of what was the response from the field?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Daryl for clarifying the wimpy syndrome, because I thought when you were saying wimpy, it was like people were too wimpy to speak out about that. And certainly nonprofits are careful enough not to speak out in front of foundations, and I certainly understand that. In fact, we had a meeting with a California legislator related to a donor advised fund bill, and we had one development director come to that meeting with the legislator as long as his executive director had plausible deniability that he had gone to the meeting, because they were so worried that the community foundation might find out that they were supporting that. But in any case, I think we're dating ourselves by saying that we remember the Popeye cartoon with Wimpy, who always said, I'm happy to give you $1 on Tuesday for a hamburger today. So thanks for that. I just wanted to say, I feel like the community foundations, let me step back for a second. You know, when agribusiness, and we feel this very strongly in California, most of agriculture is agribusiness. It's huge conglomerates, factories. But there are also still a lot of family farmers. And when legislation is proposed to regulate agribusiness, they put the family farmers on the witness stand. And, you know, they have 2 employees and their mom and dad and grandpa and everybody is working on the farm. And I think really that we need to have different regulations for agribusiness than we do for family farms. And similarly, we need to have different regulations for the big commercial $1 billion, et cetera, donor advised fund sponsors than we do for the kind of authentic community-based organizations. And that's something that, and I think the community foundations have sometimes been playing the role of the family farms, unintentionally providing cover for agribusiness, if you will. In California, we have sponsored 2 bills in the California legislature for transparency, not for changing payout requirements, but for more transparency. Neither one of them died in the first committee. The other one, right before the pandemic, passed the first house. But before it got to the second house, the pandemic struck. And literally 80% of the bills that had been passed by the first house that year got swept into a kind of a holding bin because of the COVID emergency. So we did not bring a bill this last year, partly because we have been so involved in contract reform. Some of you know that we have 7 bills right now in the California legislature related to improving how government contracts with nonprofits. And we just couldn't take on any more than that, but we still do have an author who is very interested in continuing to pursue the issue. And I think the fact that we have more than 900 people registered for this webinar shows there's a continuing interest, a strong interest in, and there is a constituency reform, but it's a quiet constituency because of people's fear of publicly criticizing in any way the foundation community.
Thanks, Jan. So I'm going to ask Robert and Lauren, who've been closely following the questions coming in, to help field what were some of the burning questions that you have flagged?
I think first we could let Alex chime in. I know he's had his hand raised, and I'll allow him to speak for a moment.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. So I just wanted to say, as your man in Washington, so I'm from California originally, from Sonoma County, went to Santa Rosa High School. And I'm now in Washington, and I think I am part of this group that Chuck identified as people who talk to members of Congress. I used to work for the Joint Committee on Tax and advise members of Congress and their staff about tax legislation. I wrote tax legislation for them. So I fear that I may be part of the maligned group of people who is opposed to things like the ACE Act. I first want to say I don't think that I or any of my colleagues or anyone else has the power to persuade Congress not to do something it wants to do. So I don't think that the reason things like the ACE Act are not being taken up and moved through Congress is due to lobbying. I think it's due to a fundamental disagreement about the legislation. And that was why I think webinars like this are so important, so that maybe we can all get on the same page about what the problem is and what solutions might be appropriate for that problem. I think it's important to consider that income inequality is a very real thing, and it's a big deal, and it is very unfair. That said, there is a simple way to address income inequality, and that is through tax rates on income, which, you know, is not really our issue here today. That's what it's everyone's issue, and anyone with the power to change the tax rates should certainly go forth and argue for that. But it's not appropriate necessarily for the charitable community to itself be responsible for income inequality. It's like, you know, if we were an angry mob protesting unfairness and income inequality of a wealthy nobleman, would our first act be to burn down the orphanage that wealthy nobleman created? Or should it be to, you know, should the pitchforks go to the nobleman's house and other personal assets? I mean, income inequality is not necessarily something that should cause us to restrict donor advised funds further. The 1969 Act is the outgrowth of a segregationist and racist agenda, and the restrictions on foundations, which donor advised funds are intended to solve, were put in place because foundations are very effective at changing the status quo, and members of the segregationist South didn't like that. They didn't like the Freedom Riders. They didn't like Brown versus Board of Education. They didn't like the integration of schools, and they didn't like the registration of Black voters. And so they restricted foundations, put payout requirements on them, wanted to restrict their existence for 20 years. And they're doing the exact proposals that are being suggested here to limit the power of the nonprofit sector to make people's lives better. And so I'm just very troubled, as your man in Washington, I'm very troubled by the idea, the underlying premise of legislation like the ACE Act, that we should go after and restrict further the charitable sector. I think we should do exactly the opposite and let the charitable sector flourish and bring about the change that it is there to do.
Okay, there are multiple parts of the ACE Act, you know, including sort of transparency and accountability measures. And one of those, and Chuck has talked about the transfers from private foundations to DAFs. So two key parts of the 69 Tax Act were that foundations had to report the name and purpose of their grants and had a 5% payout requirement. So currently, there's this practice of private foundations transferring funds to DAFs, which is in effect a runaround around the disclosure requirement of, well, what is the actual use of the funds? Now, the attorneys general have parallel jurisdiction, and so it is their job, as well as the IRS, to make sure that all funds are used properly for exempt purposes. Now, a number of these foundations have restricted funds, so their donor has, in the trust instrument, has restricted it as to purpose. Well, there's no way, the AG's offices never see how these funds get used. They get transferred to a DAF and it's a black hole. So no one knows actually how these funds are being used or whether there is a breach of trust or not. So the part of the ACE Act would address this by requiring disclosure of how are the funds actually being used. Do you think, is there an appetite for sort of correcting this runaround of the disclosure requirement?
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yep. So yes, but first we have to distinguish the campaign finance issue from the charitable issue. Just like with income inequality, there is a massive problem in this country of disagreement about how campaign finance should operate. Should corporations be allowed to make campaign contributions? Citizens United said yes. That allowed all corporations to contribute, including 501c4s, 5s, 6s. And the disclosure regime on charities and 501c4s is intended to address donor privacy and donor anonymity many times for good and valid reasons, like I'm just trying to help people out and I don't want to take personal credit, a noble reason to make a gift. But political campaign finance has a very different transparency objective, and it's due to the fact that in 2010, the Supreme Court allowed corporations to get involved in campaign finance, that we now have this issue of, oh my God, transparency, 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 because it's for the political reason, not the charitable reason. So the attorneys general are very interested in identifying campaign finance contributions. It's a huge problem, but again, it's not a charitable problem. It's a campaign finance problem. And the fact that the country is divided over campaign finance and it all falls into the charitable sector is not something that we should rip apart the charitable sector to solve.
Well, this, I wasn't referring to a campaign finance because it's still prohibited that the private foundations cannot use their funds to influence elections or coordinate activities with political parties or support or oppose candidates. But let me go back to Robert and Lauren. Do you have some questions for us?
Let's let Chuck chime in here.
Yeah, I just saw Chuck had a question.
Oh, okay.
Just simple. I mean, I think that the most simple thing we're talking about is a design flaw, fixing a design flaw. You know, the social contract is you get a tax reduction, the money should go to a qualified charity. It shouldn't hang out in an intermediary for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. Many donors follow that understanding. But for those who don't, we need to tweak the law to encourage the flow. So whether it's a minimal payout, I actually think just moving funds within a 5-year period or a 2-year period, some adjustment to that mismatch, just to protect the taxpayer interest. The taxpayer has an interest. We're subsidizing this. And the wealthier the donor, the bigger the tax subsidy is. So, you know, as others have researched, you know, for every dollar that billionaires are giving now to their DAFs and their private foundations, we're chipping in the form of 74 cents of lost tax revenue, because it's not just income tax, it's gift and estate tax reduction. So it's a significant subsidy. In order to honor the public interest here, we should just tweak this. That's the minimal thing. I think looking at transparency issues, because now DAFs are part of the shell game that moves money to dark money groups, which is an issue that Jan and the CalNonprofits have looked at. Simple transparency reporting is another important reform. So we're not trying to tackle the whole inequality issue here. We're just trying to address a warehousing problem, funds not moving in a timely way.
You know, the point about, if I may, the point about warehousing is deeper than that, because what we're really saying is that any money that isn't being currently used to produce charitable goods and services is not charitable. And so by saying there should be no intermediaries, you're saying there should be no endowments, there should be no investments, and all charities should live hand to mouth without any savings at all, which is a way to run the charitable sector, but I would submit is not a good one, because it would undermine and eliminate the institutions themselves, the institutions that are created through charitable giving, including private foundations and donor advised funds, are institutions that are long-lived and learn over time which causes to support, which grants were good, which were bad, how to navigate a complex and always changing environment, exercising prudence and wisdom of trustees, and deploying charitable funds for their highest and best use in their judgment. The idea of eliminating all of that savings and institutional knowledge, I think, would really weaken the charitable sector.
Daryl, let's
No
hear
one is-
from you.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Alex just said. I don't think that the problem is the fact that we don't have to make a payout within any certain period of time. I think the indefiniteness with which donors can decide when to make a payout gives them opportunities for abuse that are increasingly intolerable. I mean, somebody mentioned dark money use of DAF funds. I think Chuck talked about a design flaw. I just think this is a design flaw, but we shouldn't outlaw, all Pintos, because not that donor advised funds are Pintos, but we should improve the vehicle, not just scrap the whole vehicle.
Yeah, there's an interesting analogy to the charitable property tax exemption, that generally you can't maintain fallow land that's not actually doing anything, where there's no public benefit, and get a charitable tax deduction or be exempt from the property tax. But let me go back to Robert and Lauren. Do you have a question for us? Lauren, you're muted.
I didn't know if Robert did. Let me pull up what I have. We have a few questions that haven't been answered from the chat. Well, this goes to the discussion we were having, which is one argument for the status quo is that a well-meaning DAF owner is thinking they're helping to grow the amount of money that they can give to charities. So somebody wanted that addressed. If they
Yes.
understand correctly, if that's the case, and how
Yeah,
that.
the inside buildup in a DAF is totally tax-free, and if you want to make one big impact give rather than a bunch of smaller impact gives, then the DAF is a good thing. And I really think that the DAF is a great way to encourage pluralism in charitable in civil society, but I don't need a 25% abuse rate to think that we need to do something. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry. Well, anyway, so I think if there's an abuse rate of about 20%, if 20% of the DAFs are being abused, that's enough for me to want to have some further legislation. So I'm not wedded to these people need to make disbursements within 5 or 20 years. It can be longer for me, except that the length of time leads to further opportunities for abuse and misuse of the wealth.
And maybe Daryl, you could clarify what you mean by abuse.
Well, I in the chat I gave an example of, if I'm the sort of the unofficial owner of a donor advised fund, and I'm out doing my thing in business or finance and something, and I can influence my bargaining partner with a donation to his, her, or its favorite charity. I have that sort of influence by virtue of the fact that the payout is indefinite, and I can pick and choose when I want to pay out. Now, of course, charities do that all the time, so it's not the discretion, but it's the potential, seemingly the increasing potential to use donor advised wealth for private benefit.
Great, thank you. Robert, did you have any questions? I have a few others.
Why don't you go ahead with one more question?
Okay, can the panel consider the influence of the elimination of the universal charitable deduction in 2017 on the trend towards DAF giving?
Yes, absolutely. The fact that the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the standard deduction and reduced the home mortgage deduction and state and local tax deduction meant that 90% or 87% of taxpayers are no longer itemizers and are unable to claim a charitable contribution deduction. And so in order to get a deduction, the gifts have to be quite a lot bigger, and that may well cause a donor to choose a DAF to make a single large contribution rather than to one particular charitable organization. It's hard to say from the data what that is, but I think the main driver for charitable giving is wealth. And what we're seeing presently, and we will certainly see in the future, is the retirement of the baby boomers who control $80 trillion. They have the vast hold over the assets in the country, and they're going to make a lot of charitable contributions. So that's what we're going to see. It's a generational thing.
You know, we should say that only some of the baby boomers have those funds.
Some of them, and only some of them, are charitably inclined.
Yeah.
I do want to pull another question, policy advocacy related. If congressional legislation was to take shape, what committee would it start with? And essentially, which elected officials could we start reaching out to?
Yes, the tax writing committees are the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. So you'd want to start there and find members on those committees who would be amenable to legislation. And then then of course, leaders in the House and the Senate. Leadership is critical to getting legislation enacted.
All right. Robert, do you think you maybe had some?
I think now we're going to head to John for a little bit of closing thoughts, and then Jan will finish up.
Well, I think the big question is, well, what's next? You know, and do we see, and maybe we could start with you, Alex, and then go to Daryl, and then Chuck, and then finish with Jan. But just say a few words about, you know, what's the appetite? What's the current temperature? Do we see action in the next 2 years? And what would it take? So Alex, first.
Sure, I'll give you two answers. One answer is what I would like to see, and then the other answer is what may well happen. So first, what I would like to see is I would like all of us who disagree to come together and find common ground and focus on that to move forward. I think that it's really important for the charitable sector to be united. We have so many enemies, and both political parties are all too happy to take away tax benefits. It's just easy to do, and so in order for the charitable sector to thrive, I think it's good for everyone to get on the same page. Personally, I think that we should. That if you want to see less DAF activity, we should reduce the 69 Act and make foundations less undesirable. I think people are choosing DAFs because the 69 Act very unfairly restricted private foundations. And if private foundations were more of a viable option, I think more people would choose them instead of DAFs. And for now, we have DAFs. But yes, thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Sorry.
Well, you know, to the extent there is some inefficiency or inequity in how we tax DAFs or not, I think it's just one of 1,000 little cuts in the tax code. I mean, there's lots of things in the tax code that are inefficient, and I don't think that any single one, particularly the DAF, is going to generate a whole bunch of emotion against DAFs or how they're currently regulated. And secondly, earlier we talked about the nonprofits. No, the nonprofits are not wimpy about it, but they have an economic interest in letting this ride, because the winners are winning and the losers hope to win at some future point. You know, in the final analysis, the nonprofits are saying, yeah, we might not be getting anything right now, but at least people are setting aside more money, so the pool is growing, and maybe one day we'll participate in the increased pool.
Yeah, so it's like the lottery. It could happen. Chuck?
I think that there is an appetite, and I think it's because philanthropy is becoming more top heavy. The nonprofit sector is doing great work. This isn't about the whole charity sector. This is about the intermediaries controlled mostly by wealthy donors, and they have so much more power, and what we're seeing is charity becoming another extension of private power in an already unequal and struggling to maintain our democracy. So I think what we're talking about, very simple. I think there's an appetite for common sense charity reform. This isn't going to put the sector out of business. It's just going to make the funds flow better. And, increase foundation payout, require donor advised funds to have some form of payout, transparency reforms, incentives to help the 90% of people who no longer itemize get some benefit from also their charitable giving. Low and middle income people tend to give directly to the charities in their communities. Wealthy people give to intermediaries. So the more the charity money is coming from the wealthy, the more is going to end up parked, short-term or long-term parking, in intermediaries. And that's the little piece that needs some attention. It would have a great impact. It would greatly increase the flow of money to the nonprofit sector, less warehousing, more flow. That's the goal.
Thank you, Chuck. And thank you, Jan, for having us. We'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John, for moderating, and thanks to everybody. And I appreciate the fact that this group of people is not 100% in agreement about a lot of things. I think that's part of the dialogue that we need to have. I did want to mention how the DAF industry is changing. Here in California, the fintech industry, the financial technology industry, it just feels like every week there's a new donor advised fund sponsor starting up. And these days, the new ones that are starting are also providing not just donor advised fund services, but also they're acting as fiscal sponsors. So it just increases sort of the ability for there to be this black box of charitable dollars that don't know where it's coming from and don't know where it's going. So it creates an opportunity for abuse that I think for dark money is one, for personal benefit. Also the way that assets are controlled, not just how the distributions are controlled. Large donors at all donor advised fund sponsors are able to control the placement of assets, not just where grants go to them. In addition, a couple of years ago, I had a meeting with one of the big national Wall Street firms that are donor advised fund sponsors, and they said that more than 10% of their contributions were coming in crypto. I haven't asked them recently, but I think kind of that point of donor advised funds and fiscal sponsorships and crypto all creates kind of just like, it's like putting candy in front of kids. Like some of them are going to eat it responsibly, and others are going to, like my kids, they're going to eat more candy than they should be eating. So I do want to especially thank our folks today. I think in terms of what's next, I think something I learned from Daryl is, that we need to convene and coalesce the constituency. As we talk more and more amongst each other in safe spaces, we can iron out what there is a consensus and what we can talk about, what we can't talk about. So I really appreciate all those things. I want to thank the more than 900 people that are joining us today. I also want to especially thank our off-camera staff at CalNonprofits. You saw Robert and Lauren, but also Lynn and Vanessa are also on our staff managing all the tech and all the other kinds of registration and all those kinds of supports. So thanks everybody. If you're on the West Coast, have a great lunch. See everybody. Bye.